Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. I am Suarez Tavernier, and in this place I talk about philosophy, psychology, the arts, history, and in general ideas. Those very passionate ideas that have changed the humans and our history and that are, when explained in a good way, very entertaining. It seems like lately we're missing the point with entertainment, because we think and tend to value it just for offering us a time that you can sit in front of a TV, you can listen to a podcast maybe or whatever, and the only thing that you're expecting is to be disconnected from life. But maybe that's not the point always. Maybe entertainment can also be, challenging. It can be fruitful for the mind and for the intellect, and you can, whenever you finish the movie, the episode, or the podcast, you can live with something else, something more, something that will make you think and hopefully be useful at some point in your life. Okay, another thing that I want to tell you before we start is that I have a webpage, I have my social media, and particularly I am writing every single week an article. It's a challenge. I'm going to be doing that for 100 weeks. So 100 articles in 100 weeks. And today we are on number 16. So if you have missed the previous ones, go ahead to the webpage or to my channel here on YouTube and you can see more videos on that. Today I'm going to talk about what is philosophy? As said, this is an article I wrote, so I'm going to be guiding you through the article. And so I'm going to read pieces of it and explain and give references and recommendations and stuff through the video. So the big question, what is philosophy? Everyone tends to ask that question. It's the number one question you get as a philosopher. What the hell do you do? Well, I'll try to answer it to you today. This is not going to be a very elementary video. It's not going to be, explained with apples. It's going to be a bit more challenging than that, but still very clear. So what is it? The first thing we need to keep in mind is to clean up or to clear up two confusions. The first one is that philosophy is the same as having a philosophy of life. That's not the case. It's fine that you have a philosophy of life, which is your approach to your existence based on a set of principles, and you decide to live that way. For instance, with Stoicism, the Stoics are very common and easy to follow and very good to have a daily life. So that's one thing, the philosophy of life. But that's not particularly philosophy as a discipline. Now, the second confusion is that philosophy is all about philosophizing. In the way that when you're out with some friends having dinner and you start drifting off in the conversation and suddenly someone says, "Oh, sorry, I was just philosophizing." Well, that's not what we philosophers do. And in the same way, when you are, discussing something and you again drift off and trying to find explanations to things that you don't know, and you say, well, yeah, now this is philosophy. Well, that's not the case either. I mean, we drift off quite a lot, but we do it differently. We do it with structure, and we do it in a way that is full of intention, because we want to get from point A to point B, even if the way gets a bit messy. So just to give you a comparison, saying that you are a philosopher because you philosophize about life is kind of like saying that you're a mathematician because you can split the check with your friends when you go out to dinner. Or saying that you're a doctor because you know what ibuprofen is for. And don't get me wrong, I wouldn't blame you for that, even if it's thinking in such a casual term. Because after all, you know that you're not a mathematician and you know that you're not a doctor because you know what mathematicians do and you know what doctors do. However, it would be hard to say that you're not a philosopher if you don't know what philosophers do. And to be honest, many in the field do not know what philosophers do either. But let's make it public. Let's talk about this and let's give an answer to that question. So what is philosophy? And what does a philosopher do? Let's start with the first question. What is philosophy? This is a definition of mine. And I say philosophy is the discipline that studies the most profound theoretical principles of any given phenomenon, or for that matter, of any given discipline. We arrive at this principle by asking the right questions. So philosophy is much about asking. Yet, surprisingly, many in the philosophical community believe that asking questions it's all that philosophy should do, and that it should never give answers. You would be like, what? And you're right to feel that way. I am on the side that philosophy should give answers, always. But there's the other side in philosophy that says, no. Philosophy is just about asking the right questions and then letting all the other disciplines work the answers. Fortunately, for me, for us in this video, that hasn't been the case. Philosophy has actually given many answers, and we continue to do so, and hopefully will continue to do so for a long time. Okay, so let's try and break the definition down. Here's the definition again. Philosophy is the discipline that studies the most profound theoretical principles of any given phenomenon, or for that matter, of any given discipline. And now let's do it with an example. Science. Let's talk specifically about physics. You have, let's say, Newton, his second law, F equals ma. Anyone knows this, at least by heart, because we were all punished with it through primary and secondary school. But in English, F equals ma translates to something like the acceleration of an object is directly proportional to the net force acting on it and inversely proportional to its mass. Now, in even better English, in a better translation, it is how fast something speeds up depends on how hard you push it and how heavy it is. As simple as that. Now, physics, of course, can explain how the theory works, right? But have you ever wondered about the fundamental elements of F equals ma, meaning the theory? For instance, what does acceleration mean? Now, a physicist might say, well, it's velocity divided by time, and that's acceleration. Great. But what is time? And there, philosophy of science begins. So you see, it's about asking the profound, fundamental questions. Now, the same applies to mathematics. So we all know, and if you don't, there's something wrong, but we all know that 2 plus 2 is 4. And that's a bit obvious, but what is 4? I mean, what is a number? What's the nature of a number? Does it exist? Does a 4 exist without humans, without our minds? Or is it just the result of our own minds projecting it onto the external world? So if I say to you, there are 4 apples on the floor, if we manage to erase any conception of 4 and number, would there be 4 apples on the floor? Or how would you interpret that? So you see the dilemma. Now, mathematicians can tell you 2 plus 2 equals 4. Philosophers can tell you the nature of numbers. And that's, of course, part of philosophy of mathematics. And not only nature of numbers, but very difficult and profound questions about mathematics. In that sense, a very good recommendation if you are interested in the philosophy of mathematics, you have Bertrand Russell, who is very well respected in the field. He has a theory of sets, which is very interesting and puzzling. And I will put in the description a video from another account in YouTube that I admire and like a lot about that particular paradox. There's a paradox there. It's called set theory, and it's very interesting. Another great recommendation is to follow Terence Tao, who is this amazing mathematician, super famous, and he's very calm, very charming. He has a master class, which is very good. As the 1900s approached, philosophy became preoccupied with all kinds of subjective questions. You get all the scientific revolution, and then in philosophy we get a time where it was more about the self rather than the external world. It was about inquiring into the nature of being human, the nature of being, to experience, which we usually call phenomenology, and not so much as clear, scientific-like questions and answers. So philosophy became preoccupied with subjective questions, and they were often expressed in a style and language that was far from easy to comprehend. And this is very common in certain philosophers who are actually famous for being complicated. And although this was not the case for philosophers in antiquity, so if we go all the way back, if we go to Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, there you can read, for instance, Plato and get a very good idea of what the guy is trying to tell you, right? You can read the dialogues, which are in fact dialogues, answers, questions and answers, questions and answers. And you can follow it because it was meant to be written for everyone to comprehend. Now, if you analyze them with profundity, then it becomes a bit more challenging because you never actually get an answer, but rather a bunch of questions. But at the first encounter, it's very, intuitive. Well, maybe not very intuitive, but intuitive enough. And here's a tip for you. When I was younger, I was always struggling with how to remember Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, because it's easy to follow them in the chronological order. But here's a tip for you. My way to solving that, it was whenever you go to a spa day, you can sit, chill, and philosophize. Well, the word spa attends to S for Socrates, P for Plato, A for Aristotle. Moving on. The philosophers that I was telling you about that are fairly confusing are, of course, Nietzsche, Heidegger, Hegel, Schopenhauer, and the one who I think is the worst is Gadamer. Typically the Germans are very complicated for some reason. Their approach to philosophy is anything but clear. And there's a reason for that. And the reason is that they were dealing with very complicated, profound, subjective, theoretical stuff. So imagine trying to describe the nature of existence. Most probably your explanation of that is not going to be easy and graspable for everyone, because there will be so much intellectual work into that it will be confusing in a way. But the point in philosophy, at least in my perception and my taste and the way I like to do philosophy, is that it doesn't really matter if it's complicated and obscure, because you can actually find your way through that and come out the other way with a very robust interpretation by using your creativity and your intellectual power and your own influence and interpretation of whatever is being discussed in the book or the paper. So there are some philosophers like me who enjoy that confusion, because philosophy is also that. It's also the way to the answer, not just the question and the answer, but, walking the walk. Heidegger, if you're interested in the philosophy of art, Heidegger has a very popular, interesting, and influential paper on that. It's on the nature of the work of art. I will also put that in the description. Very brief, but it basically explains what the object of art is. Then if you're interested in Nietzsche, well, there's a bunch of literature in that, and he's getting famous by the day. You get, of course, Those Spoke Zarathustra. Very good work. Very interesting, very challenging, and probably a must if you enjoy literature and philosophy. And you also have approaches to art from Nietzsche that are very influential. There's a reading of Nietzsche about drama and where drama comes from. I recommend that as well. And then there's an interpretation of philosophy and history from Nietzsche, which is great. And then, speaking of definitions of art, he was not a philosopher in a way, but Tolstoy has a definition of art and has a book that is dedicated to trying to explain art. Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, they were both philosophers in a way. Probably Dostoevsky more. He was more of a philosopher. Tolstoy was more of a sociologist. Okay, so you have that tradition. And then, of course, you have the other side. The side that doesn't enjoy literature that much, or the literature style. And the ones who value things that are succinct, clear, concise, as, for instance, the scientific method. These kind of philosophers, this school of philosophy, we're talking about the analytic part of philosophy. We were talking about the continental part of philosophy. Now we're talking about the analytic part of philosophy. This school of philosophy wanted to, in a way, clean the house, reformulate the methods with which philosophy was being done. And ultimately, their approach can be summarized as language. The philosophical problems, all of them, are problems of language. Now, to fight the fight, their weapon, their medium of expression, instead of poetic, fluid, narrative language, they chose nothing like that, but rather reductive notation. This, of course, sounds as logic. Logic is the most reductive, concise, clean thing that you can actually get to. It has mathematical principles, and it was developed by, well, a long time ago, Plato and Aristotle, but more recently, Bertrand Russell again, Frege, and Wittgenstein. Now, on this last figure, Ludwig Wittgenstein, is a very, very interesting figure. I am not passionate about analytical philosophy, nevertheless, and he's the most analytical philosopher of all time. Nevertheless, his life, himself as a man, as a person, is so interesting. He was born in a very noble family in Austria. They were super rich, and at some point he decided to just give everything away and went on living to a fjord up in the north and committed himself to do philosophy all the time. And he was driven between this spiritual force, but also his morality, but also, the philosophy and the interpretation of the world and the challenges of being alive and all of that. Later in his life, he became more of an open philosopher. He inquired into psychology, even into God. So, a very complete figure that I highly recommend. And I'm going to leave in the description the link to the biography that I read, and it was incredible. So at the point that the community splits, many philosophers continue to focus on questions about experience, morality, ethics, the good life, God, love, friendship, and art, aesthetics, the philosophy of art, and came to be known as Continental philosophers, as we just mentioned, since their approach remained largely in Europe and also as seen in the East. So you have Chinese philosophy, Indian philosophy, Buddhist philosophy. There are other traditions, not you cannot call them continental philosophy per se, but they are much more open than analytic philosophy. The other side, the analytic philosophers, focused on the analysis of words, sentences, meanings, concepts, and similar concerns. Hence the name analytical. The type of philosophy, that type of philosophy, analytic philosophy, is now being practiced all over the world, but it's most prominently in the UK and the US, as already said. Now, despite the divide, the question remains: what do philosophers do? We know what philosophy is, but we do not know what philosophers do. To put it simply, we are engineers of knowledge. Philosophers are engineers of knowledge. We take an idea, a concept, a thought, a principle, a truth, a falsehood, whatever it is, and break it apart. Then, when we have everything scattered, all the pieces in the floor, we analyze each of them, and we bring the concept, the truth, the falsehood, whatever it is, back together in a simpler way, in a more direct way. We like to break down things and then rebuild them in a clearer, more solid form. But what's the point of that? What's the point of being an engineer of thought, of knowledge? Well, it's simple. It provides the grounds upon which all other disciplines stand. We go the deepest that the human mind can go. We explore those realms, and then we set the groundwork for all other disciplines to build on top of that. This might sound theoretical, but let me give you an example. Philosophy in relation to art. How important is what we do as philosophers in relationship to the art world? You remember, most probably, I think it was Miami some years ago, that there was an artwork, literally, a banana duct taped to the wall. And it sold for millions. And not so long ago, the second owner, no, it was not the second owner. There were two pieces. One was sold by Sotheby's or Christie's, probably in the UK. And the guy, a crypto millionaire, came to the place, bought the banana, made a conference show, and he ate the banana. And he was laughing because he said that it was not about the piece, the object, but rather about the concept, which is something I will explore in some weeks to come. But in any case, you would probably agree, and I wouldn't blame you, in saying that that's not art, not at all. And as that instance, there are many other instances. Another very common is Marcel Duchamp's Fontaine, the urinal. You can probably say, well, that's not art. And again, I agree with you. But then I would ask you, okay, if that's not art, what is art? And hence the trouble. And that's where philosophers come in. We come in to solve those types of questions and to give definitions. So, if we don't know what art is, how can we know what art isn't? How can we guide a market? How can we criticize a work? How can we judge a work? How can we value a work? We can't. We simply can't. And because we do not have solid philosophical grounds in the art world, we have what we have now, which is basically a joke. You go and you see conceptual art everywhere, and people do not have an idea of what conceptual actually is and what art actually is. And so you get basically a mess. Whereas in science, for instance, or in mathematics or other disciplines that you have a solid philosophical foundation, you do have principles that make much more sense. And the disciplines are regulated in a way and have much richer and progressive paths. These disciplines do not fall into confusion. So we're trained as philosophers to think systematically, to assess arguments upon arguments, and to work through intricate levels of thoughts, sometimes exploring subjective scenarios or exaggerated possibilities. We are trained to think differently, not outside the box, but in a way that divagation has no place. Yes, we can go to a certain extent, but we always come back. We always target the point. We do not drift. And again, if we do, we're guided by the proper questions and in the spirit of building or deconstructing an idea. When we finish doing that, we put everything into words. So in a sense, we're also writers. Science and technology have pushed aside the humanities and stolen all the attention. Rarely does anyone think of philosophy these days, except as a philosophy of life or philosophizing with friends over dinner. But the truth is that philosophy has always been there. Even if now AI is the thing, even if sending rockets to the moon is a thing, or being a billionaire is a thing, or being an influencer is a thing, philosophers have always been there, working silently, but always working, with effort, with passion, with dedication. We are in the midst of a storm nowadays, but we've been hanging there with all our might to stay afloat. And the storm is because, humanities are in decline. There's a threat that philosophy is ever more distant and that we are going to be overcome by artificial intelligence. And you can see that in geopolitics around the world. You can see that in local governments cutting short all the benefits for the universities and particularly for the humanities. Something that we philosophers understand is that our task is quiet and foundational. We lay the groundwork upon which every other beauty is built. We as philosophers lay the groundwork for every other single discipline. So there you go. We know what philosophers do, we know what philosophy is, and it all comes down to knowledge. It has limits when the other discipline starts, and it's a silent, constant work upon which everything is built. I hope you enjoy this. If you want more recommendations in regards to philosophy, I'm always open for that. Send me a message, leave me a comment, and I will give you the best as I can. And I invite you once more to go into my channel, go into my webpage, read the articles, which I write with dedication and love for you and for everyone, and let me know what you think. This project is more than anything intended to build community and to have a good time doing so. That was pretty much it. Thank you, and until next time.